Hello everyone, welcome back to Philosophizing with a Hammer. Today we are continuing our series on the bold and provocative ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche. So in the last two episodes, we explored the will to power and the earth-shaking declaration that God is dead. If you haven't listened to those yet, I highly recommend checking them out first, because they lay the foundation for today's discussion and will help you follow the link between these ideas and what we're diving into today. So it's fair, however, to refresh our memory a little bit with what we saw last time. With the will to power, we said it was Nietzsche's way of explaining the driving force behind everything in life. So it is not just about survival or power over others, it is about our inner urge to grow, create, and overcome challenges. It is what pushes us to constantly improve, express ourselves, and shape the world around us. However, it is important to understand that this isn't about domination or violence. It is about personal transformation and becoming the best version of ourselves. Then we explored Nietzsche's famous statement that God is dead. This doesn't mean a literal death, but rather a shift in society where traditional religious values have lost their power. Without those moral and spiritual guidance that religion once provided, many people feel lost or disconnected. So, Nietzsche saw this as both a crisis that can lead to nihilism and also an opportunity. So, yes, it can lead to a sense of meaninglessness in life and nihilism, but it also opens the door for us to create our own values and purpose. You see, this is where Nietzsche is often misunderstood. People thinking that with saying something like God is dead, it means you're instantly a nihilist, someone who dislikes life and Schopenhauerian, Well, no, Nietzsche is clearly trying to make us look at the positive side of the death of God, which is the revaluation of everything, which is what this episode is going to be about. The Übermensch. So, together, these two ideas, the will to power and the death of God, they set the stage for today's discussion on the Übermensch, which is Nietzsche's vision of what comes after the death of traditional values. So the Übermensch is someone who embraces life, creates their own meaning, and rises above challenges of the modern world. For further details about the statement of God is dead and the revaluation of all values and the will to power, I highly recommend you checking out the previous two episodes for further details and to see how all these ideas connect and lead us to today's topic. So, I will start off by asking you to picture this out. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast canyon, staring across at a distant peak, shrouded in clouds. The path behind you is clear, well trodden, familiar, safe, everything. You're familiar with it. It's not scary, but the bridge ahead, well, it's narrow, precarious, and unfinished. Crossing it requires courage, risk, and a willingness to leave the old certainties behind. Nietzsche saw humanity in this very, very moment, caught between what we have been and what we could become. What if humanity is not the end of the story, but merely a stepping stone to something greater? What if our purpose isn't to confirm, but to transcend? That's when the concept of the Übermensch is stated. So the Übermensch, I've been bragging about it for a couple of minutes now. What is it? It's often translated as the overman or Superman. It lies at the heart of Nietzsche's daring vision for the future. It represents the idealized future of human evolution. The Übermensch embodies the highest potential of humanity, transcending the limitations of conventional morality, religion values, and societal norms. Nietzsche first introduced the concept, the Übermensch, in his philosophical novel Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which was written between 1883 and 1885. The Übermensch is presented as the central idea of Zarathustra's teachings. It's a vision for the future of humanity after the death of God and the collapse of the traditional moral systems. Nietzsche uses Zarathustra to explore the idea that humans must transcend their current state and create new values to overcome the existential crisis triggered by the death of God. So, what exactly is the Übermensch? Let's explore it together in a way that is straightforward and relatable. So, the Übermensch is Nietzsche's vision of someone who rises above conventional ways of thinking and living, especially in a world where traditional values no longer hold sway. What Nietzsche called the death of God is a stepping stone to avoiding nihilism and reaching the stage of the Übermensch. With the old frameworks gone, the Übermensch steps in, creating new values that celebrate life in all its richness and complexity. So this isn't about being reckless or selfish, but it's more about reimagining what it means to live meaningfully. Think of it as an attitude of embracing life with open arms. The Übermensch doesn't avoid life struggles or contradictions. Instead, they see these challenges as a part of what makes life beautiful. They refuse to give in to nihilism, the idea that life has no meaning. Instead, they actively create their own meaning through their actions, ideas, and creativity. A big part of this is what Nietzsche called self-overcoming. The Übermensch is constantly evolving, pushing past personal fears, limitations, and even old versions of themselves. This isn't just about improving skills or gaining knowledge. It's about deep personal growth. It means questioning long-held beliefs, embracing discomfort, and using those experiences to transform into someone stronger and more authentic. Another idea, which is tied to the Übermensch, is Nietzsche's concept of the eternal recurrence. So, the thought of that every moment of your life, good or bad, will repeat infinitely, it's haunting for some people. It feels overwhelming, but for the Übermensch, they embraces it fully. They live with such intensity and purpose that they wouldn't change a thing about their lives, even if it meant living the same moments forever. It's about loving your life as it is, flaws and all, finding joy in its imperfections. It is also important to clear up a common misconception, which is the Übermensch isn't about dominating others or being a ruler. It's not about being a conqueror. It's not about power in that sense. Instead, it's about mastering yourself, living with authenticity, and creating your own values and creativity while rejecting the need to conform to societal expectations. This idea was dangerously misinterpreted by historical figures like Hitler, which we will talk about later in the episode. We will see how some people misuse this concept for personal gain. But for now, let's focus on the good side of it. So, the Übermensch rises above mediocrity, not to control others, but to lead by example and show what is possible when you fully embrace life. So, ultimately, the Übermensch isn't just an individual ideal. Nietzsche saw it as a vision for humanity, a symbol of what we could become if we embrace the challenge of creating meaning in a chaotic and unpredictable world. It is not about perfection or reaching a fixed goal. It is about the courage to strive for something greater, to keep growing, and to affirm life in its entirety. In the end, the Übermensch is less about arriving at a destination and more about the journey itself, a journey of living boldly and creating meaning, finding joy in the complexity of existence. So, it's safe to address now what the Übermensch is not. It is important to clear up one of the most misconceptions because, let's face it, Nietzsche's ideas have often been misunderstood, and this one is no exception. So, first and foremost, the Übermensch is not about a physical strength or genetic superiority. If you ever heard about someone misuse the term just to clarify and justify ideas of biological dominance, well, know that Nietzsche would have absolutely rejected such interpretations. He wasn't interested in who could lift the most weight or who was born with the biggest and best genes. In fact, Nietzsche detested any attempt to reduce profound philosophical ideas to such simplistic materialistic terms. So, what is the Übermensch? Again, it's a philosophical and existential ideal. Something that speaks to the potential of human beings to transcend limitations and create their own values to live authentically. The Übermensch isn't necessarily a single person, just to clarify that out. It's not as though Nietzsche was saying this is a title to the person who will claim it, like a king or a champion. No, well, some interpretations suggest that the Übermensch is more of a process, a way of life anyone can aspire to, or even a collective goal for humanity as a whole. It's about moving beyond the old and broken system of thought and striving for something greater, together or individually. As we move forward, keep this in mind. The Übermensch is not about domination, superiority, or physical prowess. It is about transformation, creation, and courage. It is Nietzsche's challenge to us, not to look for heroes or rulers, but to ask ourselves, how can we transcend who we are today? The journey of becoming the Übermensch is no walk in the park, though. It is a path that demands immense courage, resilience, and an unflinching willingness to face life as it is, in all its chaos and uncertainty. Why courage, you might ask? Well, because becoming the Übermensch means a stepping stone from the comforts of external certainties. Think about it. Throughout history, people have leaned on these things like religion, societal norms, inherited traditions to make sense of the world. These frameworks provide answers, guidance, and a sense of stability. But Nietzsche believed these structures, particularly after the death of God, were no longer sufficient. For the Übermensch, the task is to let go, basically, to leave those old crutches and confront life's uncertainties head on, relying solely on their own creative power to make meaning of their existence. And this is no small task. Imagine standing in a void where all the old maps have burned, and you're tasked with charting an entirely new course. It's daunting, even terrifying. Nihilism lurks in this void, but the Übermensch doesn't succumb to despair. Instead, they find within themselves the courage to affirm life, to create new values, and to say yes to the existence of all its complexity. But that's not all. Nietzsche reminds us that with this freedom comes an immense weight of responsibility. To create your own values means you're responsible for every choice you make and every principle you live by. There's no higher authority to pass the blame to, no external script to follow. It's all on you. And that, Nietzsche believed, is both the burden and the beauty of living as the Übermensch. As Nietzsche himself writes, quotes, he who would be a creator in good and evil must first be a destroyer. This might sound harsh, but let's unpack it. This destruction isn't about nihilism or tearing down the old beliefs and things down for the sake of chaos. No, it is about clearing the ground to make space for something new to flourish. Imagine an artist staring at a blank canvas, or a builder demolishing an old, crumbling house to lay the foundation for something stronger and more beautiful. The Übermensch must first dismantle the outdated beliefs, norms, values that no longer serve humanity or themselves before they can create something fresh and meaningful. It is a process that's painful as it is to liberate. Destruction often comes with loss, uncertainty, and the fear of what lies ahead. But it is also an act of hope, a belief that something better, richer, and more authentic can take its place. Becoming the Übermensch is not a destination or a title you achieve. It is a continuous journey of transformation. It is a way of living that requires bravery, creativity, and unrelenting commitment to growth and to grow beyond who you were yesterday. And yes, it is hard. But for Nietzsche, it is also the highest expression of what it means to be human. Throughout history, several individuals have embodied aspects of Nietzsche's Übermensch, adopting his philosophy of self-overcoming, individualism, and the creation of new values. These figures often defied societal norms and rejected conventional morality, and also sought to shape their own destinies. Probably two of my favorite examples to give are Napoleon Bonaparte and Ludwig van Beethoven. We will talk about them respectfully, starting off with Napoleon. Nietzsche's view of Napoleon as an archetype of the Übermensch is a fascinating and nuanced one. In many of his writings, Nietzsche admires Napoleon for his incredible strength of will, his ability to break free from societal and moral constraints, and his capacity to shape the course of history. Napoleon, in Nietzsche's eyes, embodies many qualities that align with the Übermensch. The figure Nietzsche presents as an ideal self-overcoming creative power and the ability to create new values was embodied by Napoleon. Let's break down this idea and provide evidence from Nietzsche's work to support this view. The figure who transcends the traditional values and morals imposed by society and religion, also culture, is Nietzsche's description of the Übermensch, as we have said. In his work, The Will to Power, which is a collection of unfinished writings and unpublished writings too, put together by Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth Foster. In this work, Nietzsche talked about the ideal people who reached the stage of the Übermensch. He describes Napoleon as someone who was able to create and assert his own values, independent of the traditional moral constraints of his time. He says, and I quote, "Napoleon was the greatest man of the 19th century who created himself out of nothing." End of quote. So Napoleon's rise to power, coming from humble beginnings and then becoming the ruler of much of Europe, demonstrates his ability to redefine the world around him. He did not simply accept the existence and the order of that time, but bent it to his will, let's say, shaping a new reality that suited his ambitions and desires. This aligns with the Übermensch, who is not bound by inherited values but seeks to create meaning and purpose for himself. And we have already dealt with the concept of the will to power, which is also the name of Nietzsche's latest work. Sadly, it's an unfinished work because Nietzsche was suffering from a lot of illnesses throughout his life, like syphilis, like chronic migraines, and other neurological issues. From that to bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, well, the dude suffered a lot in his life until the moment that he became basically unable to think and incapacitated due to his mental and physical decline. So his sister, Elizabeth Foster, gathered pretty much all of his notes and published them under the title The Will to Power. And the will to power as an idea, as we saw in previous episodes, is one of central concepts in his philosophy. It describes the fundamental force that drives all life. It is the instinct to assert oneself, to expand one's power, and to overcome any obstacles that stand in the way. So Napoleon is often viewed by Nietzsche as a perfect example of someone who embodies this will to power. Nietzsche admires Napoleon's relentless drive, his ability to push past setbacks, and his visionary goals. In The Will to Power, section 1066, Nietzsche writes, Napoleon as a man was able to achieve greatness by forcing his will upon Europe. He was a man who was determined to act according to his own will, shaping the world in his own image. End of quote. So Napoleon's success, despite overwhelming opposition, is viewed by Nietzsche as the triumph of the will to power. Napoleon's ability to push beyond traditional moral constraints and his unyielding vision and his also relentless ambition are qualities that align closely with the Übermensch as an individual who is constantly striving for more, seeking self-overcoming, and continually reshaping the world according to his will. Now, another key feature of the Übermensch is the transcendence of traditional morality. The Übermensch is not bound by conventional and moral frameworks such as those prescribed by religion or society, which Nietzsche saw as limiting human potential. Instead, the Übermensch creates a new set of values based on individual strength, creativity, and affirmation of life. Napoleon, in Nietzsche's view, was not beholden to traditional moral codes or ideals of what was right or good. His actions were guided by his own sense of power and greatness. So Nietzsche was highly critical of the conventional morality that led to the weakness and self-sacrifice, and he saw Napoleon as a figure who rejected this in favor of unrelenting and asserting his own will. In Beyond Good and Evil, another book which Nietzsche explicitly critiques traditional morality and presents the idea of the Übermensch, in that book, Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche presents the Übermensch as one who transcends conventional good and evil. Napoleon is a prime example of this rejection of conventional morality. So Napoleon's genius, and here I'm going to quote from Beyond Good and Evil, and I quote, Napoleon's genius lies in the fact that he created his own code. He used no preordained rules to guide him. He was a man who judged all things by his own standards, without submitting to any external rules or authority. End of quote. So this disregard for conventional and moral limits is one of the defining characteristics of both Nietzsche and Napoleon. By Nietzsche, I meant the Übermensch, sorry. Napoleon's rise to power and his military conquests and his political strategies were all driven by his personal vision and will. He created his own path and judgment much more as the Übermensch must do. Self-overcoming is basically what the idea of the Übermensch is all about. So self-overcoming is a central tenet to the philosophy of Nietzsche. Since the Übermensch is constantly evolving, they should grow beyond the limitations of their past, their circumstances, and their own nature. And Napoleon's life and career are exactly as seen by Nietzsche. They are a model of what self-overcoming is. Napoleon, being a man who started from humble beginnings and became a symbol of power, is the archetype of the Übermensch. He continually adapted and overcame obstacles, both internal and external, in his relentless pursuit of his vision. And in The Will to Power, Nietzsche emphasizes the importance of the overcoming of one's own weakness and limitations in the pursuit of greatness. Napoleon exemplifies this idea as he rose from a minor position in society, constantly overcoming setbacks, defeats, and failures to reshape the European political landscape. Nietzsche admired his relentless push toward greater power and mastery over oneself and one's circumstances. He says in The Will to Power, quote, Napoleon was a true individual, a man who never stopped fighting, never stopped striving, and ultimately never stopped overcoming himself. End of quote. Now, while Nietzsche admired Napoleon's strength of will, he also recognized that Napoleon was not a flawless hero in the traditional sense. He was not interested in promoting Napoleon as a tyrant or a conqueror for the sake of conquest. Instead, Nietzsche saw Napoleon as a visionary, someone whose vision of a new order was built in the foundation of his own will and power. So Nietzsche was often wary of tyranny and authoritarianism, and he did not endorse Napoleon's political methods wholesale. However, he saw in Napoleon the potential of the Übermensch, a potential that it will emerge. As an individual who dares to reshape the world, Napoleon was, in accordance, the man. Nietzsche's admiration for Napoleon lies in the figure's immense strength of will and his ability to transcend conventional morality, his relentless pursuit of greatness, and all of that. So Napoleon, in many ways, embodies the core qualities Nietzsche values in the Übermensch, which is the power to create one's own values and the unyielding drive of the will to power and the continual process of self-overcoming. While Nietzsche critiques Napoleon's political rule, he recognizes him as a tragic yet admirable figure who challenged the status quo and reshaped the world according to his own vision. In this sense, Napoleon serves as an archetype of the Übermensch and a symbol of what it means to live authentically with a total commitment of self-mastery. Now, another great example that we will delve into is one of history's greatest composers, Beethoven. You might not think immediately of Ludwig van Beethoven when discussing Nietzsche, but in many ways, Beethoven exemplifies the very ideals Nietzsche championed in his philosophy. So, what makes Beethoven the Übermensch? Let's explore how his life and music fit into Nietzsche's vision. So, you have the very early stages of Beethoven's life, in which he was already pushing the boundaries of music. As he grew older, he became more radical, reshaping the very structures of classical music. So he was already embodying the concept of the will to power, which is the asserting of one's individuality and the creation of new possibilities. Take his Symphony No. 3, for example. This piece was a huge departure from traditional symphonic structure. It was basically something that breaks through musical conventions and creates something new. The guy, if he had electricity back then, he would have been pretty much the inventor of heavy music and heavy metal. The opening theme itself is bold and triumphant, a perfect representation of the struggle and overcoming that is central to Nietzsche's philosophy. But Beethoven didn't just revolutionize music. He embraced his own will to power in his life. He didn't just follow the classical tradition, let's say, he transformed it. That's what Nietzsche meant when he spoke about the Übermensch. Not someone who blindly follows a tradition, but someone who challenges it, reimagines it, and makes something out of it. Now, perhaps what's most striking about Beethoven's life is how he embodies the idea of self-overcoming. He started losing his hearing in the late 20s, and by the time he was in his 40s, he was almost completely deaf. Now, most people would have already given up on their art in such circumstances. But Beethoven didn't. He overcame this limitation, something he was very much championed by and he was very much famous of. He overcame this limitation not by ignoring it, but by pushing through it. He kept composing, and some of his most powerful, emotionally complex works come after he became deaf. One of the most famous examples of his works is his Ninth Symphony, which he composed when he was already profoundly deaf. He couldn't hear the music the way he once had, but he could feel it. And that feeling, that inner sense of music, drove him to create a piece that was revolutionary, not just for its structure, but for its emotional depth. Now, Beethoven's defiance in the face of his personal struggles is the perfect embodiment of Nietzsche's Übermensch. He didn't succumb to despair or allow his suffering to define him. Instead, he used it as a fuel for creativity and pushing himself to new heights. One final point to consider is the tragic yet heroic nature of Beethoven's life. You see, Nietzsche's Übermensch isn't some flawless, perfect being. Rather, it is someone who embraces the suffering and challenges of life, uses those experiences to grow and becomes more than they were before. Beethoven's personal tragedies, his battles with deafness, isolation, and illness only served to intensify his music, making it deeper and more emotionally complex. The Übermensch is someone who embraces life, not despite its hardships, but because of them. Beethoven's ability to take his personal suffering and turn it into some of the most profound music ever written is a perfect example of what Nietzsche meant by the Übermensch. Someone who overcomes and grows stronger through adversity. You know the famous quote, "What doesn't kill you make you stronger." You'll be surprised to know, but that was actually something that was said by Nietzsche in his work Twilight of the Idols. So a quote that we pretty much still use nowadays, you could see it everywhere, is a perfect embodiment and a perfect summary to conclude what the Übermensch is. So to conclude about Beethoven and why is he such an ideal example of the Übermensch? Well, basically because like Nietzsche's ideal, the Übermensch, Beethoven lived a life of defiance and self-overcoming. He was someone who didn't just conform to the world around him, he transformed it. He created new values and he embraced his limitations. He basically expressed the deepest parts of the human experience through his music. Beethoven's life is a powerful reminder that the Übermensch is not a distant, abstract idea. It is something we can see, something we can strive for, and something we can embody in our own way. Just like Beethoven did with his music, we all have the potential to transcend our limitations and create new values. So, what can happen if this concept is understood in the wrong way? It's often been misunderstood throughout history and misinterpreted, and definitely has led to some of the most disturbing ideological movements in history, notably the Nazi regime under Adolf Hitler. We're going to explore how Nietzsche's ideas, specifically the Übermensch, was distorted by figures like Hitler, and why Nietzsche would have absolutely rejected these ideas that Hitler espoused, particularly regarding nationalism, collectivism, and the concept of the herd. So Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime were among the most infamous examples of how Nietzsche's philosophy was co-opted, let's say, for destructive purposes. Hitler, along his ideological followers, misinterpreted Nietzsche's ideas or wanted to distort them maybe on purpose in order to manipulate as many people as they could, especially the idea of the Übermensch. So just to justify their vision of racial superiority and the supremacy of the Aryan race, as well as the violent subjugation of marginalized groups. One of the major distortions made by Hitler and the Nazis was the interpretation of how the Übermensch, as a figure of racial or national superiority, is what Germany needs. So for Hitler, the Übermensch became a symbol of the master race, the Aryans, and was used to justify extreme racial hierarchy and discrimination. Nietzsche's emphasis on individual greatness and self-overcoming was twisted into an ideology of domination with a focus of the collective purity of the state and the subjugation of anyone deemed inferior. And I remember when I was reading Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, I was so frustrated because how the hell could you lie and manipulate everyone by simply distorting facts and certain philosophies? He would use a random quote by Nietzsche, analyze it the way he likes, and interpret it in his personal gains. You know, the worst thing is that people actually believe in that. This reminds me of a very, very, very interesting writer, Polish writer, Czesław Miłosz. He talked about this matter in a metaphor that he calls the Myrti-Bing pill. The Myrti-Bing pill is something that the ruler hands over to the citizens, to the people. They consume it and they become distorted and blinded. It's safe to honor Miłosz because he's one of my favorite writers by doing a separate episode and looking at it from a Nietzschean perspective. But for now, let's get back to how Hitler distorted the public and what Nietzsche called the herd. Hitler's use of Nietzsche's work is most notably seen in his interpretation of the will to power, to justify totalitarian rule and violent conquest. But while Nietzsche wrote about the will to power as an individual's drive to overcome internal and external limitations, Hitler used it as a tool for justifying imperialism and authoritarianism, completely missing the philosophical intent behind it. The best argument would be how Nietzsche, to begin with, he completely opposes any ideas of nationalism or collectivism. And it's at the core of his philosophy, because it's basically about what he calls the herd mentality. This is basically the opposite of what Hitler and the Nazis promoted. You see, Nietzsche was deeply critical of nationalism. And he was critical of mass movements and the idea of the collective as the ultimate unit of value. He believed that true greatness comes from individuals who overcome the hard instincts of society and rise above the conventional values and moralities imposed by the masses. Nietzsche's disdain for nationalism is clear in many of his writings, especially in Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil. He viewed nationalism and collective identities as expressions of the herd mentality, which sought to suppress individuality and creativity. So he argued that collective movements often led to conformity, mediocrity, and the suppression of unique human potential. And the idea of the Übermensch, in Nietzsche's view, was about personal transcendence, not the glorification of a nation or race. Nietzsche states, and I quote, "The nation is the most deadly form of herd mentality. It binds individuals to a group identity, suppressing the very essence of what makes them unique and great." End of quote. This is in direct opposition to the kind of nationalism espoused by Hitler, which promoted the idea of unified, racially pure Aryan state. Nietzsche would have found the idea of collective will imposed on a nation to be anathema, let's say, to his philosophy of individual self-overcoming. For Nietzsche, the Übermensch was a singular individual who rejects the herd and its values, while Hitler's ideology basically was built on the idea of collective people with a common racial identity, just blindly following the conventions because everyone is embodying it, so it must be true. That's what Nietzsche hated the most. Central to his philosophy, which is going to bring us to talk about the idea of authenticity, which is the individual's ability to create their own path in life, free from external pressures, societal expectations, or moral conventions. Nietzsche despised the herd mentality, the compulsion to conform to a group and norms, and the suppression of the individual in favor of collective values. The Übermensch is the individual who says yes to life, takes responsibility for their own values, and creates meaning in a world that offers no inherent purpose. In stark contrast, Hitler's ideology was built on conformity and obedience to the state. You see, the Nazi regime demanded strict adherence to the collective will and the idea of a unified national identity. And under Hitler's leadership, individuals were expected to subordinate their personal desires and identities to the goal of the state, with little room for individuality or personal freedom. Nietzsche, however, would have strongly rejected this. He viewed individuals who blindly followed the herd as weak and unworthy of greatness. He calls them the slaves. This is where the concept of slave morality comes. The slave morality is the idea of following what everyone is believing because it's conventional. You don't really question it. The idea of the Übermensch is, by contrast, the master. This is where his ideas of master morality and slave morality comes from. The Übermensch is precisely the opposite of what a slave is. A person who rejects the dictates of society and instead follows their own will and inner vision. Now, I've seen a lot of people writing articles about how Nietzsche would have been an anti-Semite or Hitler supporter, a Nazi, basically. And it's one of the most striking contradictions, basically, Nietzsche's philosophy and the ideas of Hitler. Nietzsche was opposed to anti-Semitism, which was a major tenet of Nazi's ideology. And his critique of anti-Semitism can be found in several of his works, especially in the Antichrist. In the Antichrist, or the Antichrist, where he criticizes the moralizing slave morality that he associates with Christianity, but also rejects the racial hatred that fueled anti-Semitism. He states, and I quote, "I have nothing but contempt for the anti-Semites. I consider them as among the most despicable and cowardly human beings." End of quote. How could someone who criticizes the idea of the herd mentality, Christianity, people who conforms, and anti-Semitism be related to the ideas of a Nazi regime that champions nationalism and hatred towards the Jews? Nietzsche saw anti-Semitism as an expression of weakness and resentment, a form of herd mentality that sought to scapegoat and oppress others rather than confront one's own limitations and potentials. You see, Nietzsche would have seen Hitler as someone opposing the will to power. Hitler's anti-Semitic ideology would have seen by Nietzsche as a perversion of the will to power, which Nietzsche believed should be directed inward, not outward in the form of hatred towards others. Now, while Nietzsche's Übermensch might be seen as a powerful figure in an existential sense, he was never interested in the kind of political power that Hitler sought. Nietzsche was deeply skeptical and critical of the state. He says in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I quote, "The state is the coldest of all cold monsters. It is the most callous enemy of the individual." End of quote. This is a stark contrast to the kind of state that Hitler envisioned, where the individual was subordinate to the collective will of the nation. Nietzsche, the champion of individualism, would have despised the totalitarianism that Hitler advocated, as it goes against the core idea of the Übermensch, which is someone who transcends society's limitations and live authentically. As we have discussed, Nietzsche's philosophy is deeply anti-authoritarian and anti-collectivist, with a profound emphasis on individual freedom and self-overcoming. Um, Hitler's Nazi regime, in contrast, was rooted in collectivism, nationalism, and a rigid authoritarian state that suppressed individual autonomy. And while Nietzsche's ideas were tragically distorted by the Nazis, they have little in common with the ideology that Hitler espoused. Uh, Nietzsche would have utterly rejected the way his ideas were hijacked to justify racism and nationalism. Now, we have covered a lot in today's episode. Uh, Before we end the episode, I want to talk about something very interesting, which is the idea of the Übermensch today. Why does Nietzsche's Übermensch matter in the 21st century? Why should a concept born over a century ago resonate with us in a world filled with smartphones, artificial intelligence, climate concerns, and a global uncertainty? Let's explore this. Well, we live in an era of rapid technological change, where advances are reshaping how we work, how we communicate, and even think. Alongside this transformation, we face daunting challenges: environmental crises that threaten the planet, political and social unrest, widespread feelings of existential uncertainty, the fear of a World War III that is about to happen, if it hasn't already sparkled. Well, questions about meaning, purpose, and identity seem larger than ever. In this context, Nietzsche's call to rise above despair and create meaning becomes profoundly relevant. The Übermensch is, in essence, Nietzsche's challenge to humanity, to refuse to be paralyzed by fear or overwhelmed by chaos. Instead of seeking comfort in old systems or external authorities, Nietzsche invites us to step into the role of creators, architects of our own lives and values. In a world where so many structures seem to be crumbling, this message feels like particularly urgent. You see, the Übermensch teaches us to live authentically. That means rejecting the pressure to conform to societal expectations or adopt beliefs that aren't our own. It's about daring to ask the big questions: what do I value? What kind of life do I want to lead? How can I contribute to something meaningful? And so on and so forth. It's an invitation to be bold in our choices and unafraid to forge our own path, even when it comes to swimming against the tide, which means going against the majority. There's a very interesting article by Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, entitled "The Crowd is on Truth." In it, he states how most of the time, when everyone starts to believe in something and it gains a majority's recognition, by and by, truth will be lost and will be distorted. You know, you'll think to yourself, oh, well, everyone's doing it, so it must be true. Well, that's the most challenging thing for the Übermensch, is to swim against the tide, to actually pause and reflect, as Mark Twain says. I love this idea by Mark Twain when he says, whenever you find yourself in the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect. It's also about creativity. In a time when algorithms and systems dictate so much of our daily lives, the Übermensch reminds us of the power of a human imagination. It is not just about creating art or innovation. It's about the act of reimagining who we are and what can we become as individuals and as society. And let's not forget courage. Nietzsche understood that life's challenges, whether personal or global, can lead to despair. But instead of succumbing to it, the Übermensch embraces the chaos, seeing it as an opportunity to grow and transform. It's a radical yes to life, even in the face of uncertainty and adversity. You see, perhaps most importantly, the Übermensch is a reminder that within each of us lies untapped potential. Nietzsche wasn't handing down a prophecy about a single perfect individual who would save humanity. He was offering a vision, a call to action for anyone willing to survive for greatness. The Übermensch isn't a distant ideal, it's a challenge to you, to me, to all of us to rise above mediocrity and dare to live fully and meaningfully. In today's world where so much feels uncertain, Nietzsche's Übermensch speaks to our deepest aspirations and fears. It encourages us not to wait for meaning to be handed down to us, but to create it ourselves. To embrace life with all its challenges and complexities and transform it into something extraordinary. That's why the Übermensch matters, perhaps now more than ever. Now, as we wrap it up in today's episode, I invite you to think about where you can embody the Übermensch in your life. How can you transcend old values, create new ones, and live with authenticity and purpose? It is a challenge, well, no doubt, but it is a challenge that holds the potential to transform both the individual and the world. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Nietzsche's philosophy and the concept of the Übermensch. You see, philosophy isn't just about abstract ideas. It is about challenging ourselves, rethinking the way we live, and finding meaning in the chaos of existence. And if this episode sparked your curiosity or inspired you to question the limits of what's possible, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You're free to leave comments on the episodes. Your perspectives are what makes this journey meaningful. So don't hesitate to reach out and share your insights. If you know someone who might find this conversation just as thought-provoking, please share the podcast with them because big ideas are best explored together. Let's keep this exploration alive. Follow the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. There's so much more of Nietzsche's bold, challenging philosophy to unpack, and I'm excited to continue this journey with you. Until next time, remember to keep questioning, keep striving, and as Nietzsche might say, dare to become who you are. Until next time, signing off.